Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest, a podcast covering topics from classical antiquity. The period of time is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Our next side quest will take us to a transitional time, a transformative time of antiquity, in which the Roman Empire goes to a new age, a new era. We will cover an emperor who reigned for a very short period of time, yet despite this very short reign, this teenage emperor has become a very significant historical figure that is a common topic of discussion among historians, classicists, podcasters, and anyone with more than a passing interest in the Roman Empire. We'll be talking, of course, about Elagabalus, emperor for 4 short years, from 218 to 222 CE. Our guide for this side quest is Zachary Herz, a professor at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Dr. Herz has a very interesting background and path that brought him to studies and teaching and scholarship of antiquity. He went to the University of Chicago, then got a law degree from Yale, then went to Columbia where he got a PhD. He has focused quite a bit on the Severan era of Roman history and also has studied a very fascinating jurist who we mentioned in passing, Ulpian. I would suggest that all of you take a little bit of time to learn a little bit more about Ulpian, and if things go well, Dr. Herz will come back and we might have another discussion about him. If after listening to this episode you want to listen to a few more podcasts with Dr. Herz, go check out The Emperors of Rome. He's been on a few episodes. They're excellent, and we discuss them in this podcast. One of the reasons that Elagabalus, despite having a very short reign, is such a very carefully studied figure and perhaps plays an oversized role in history is because not only was he a teenager, but he was very much hated by the Roman Senate. The Roman elites didn't like Elagabalus. They didn't like him because he was a teenager. They didn't like him because he was from the East. They didn't like him because he wasn't what they considered to be a traditional Roman. So what did they do? They created a narrative about Elagabalus, and they attacked Elagabalus based upon that narrative. Again, because they did not think that Elagabalus fit with their accepted norms, the senatorial elites decided to create a narrative and attack Elagabalus in the only way that they knew how. These elites, these senators, attack Elagabalus for being feminine, for not living up to the part of what the traditional view of Roman masculinity is all about. That in turn has created a concept, a discussion, a theory that Elagabalus may to some extent have been possibly transgender, or may have had some sort of gender identity or gender fluidity or gender confusion. We're not really sure. What we try to do in this podcast episode is discuss this issue with the appropriate historical backdrop in mind, while also being sensitive to the fact that Elagabalus has in many respects become a trans icon. And we don't want to take that away from anyone, and we don't want to make it seem as if we're not sensitive to the fact that having a thorough and full discussion about the narrative surrounding Elagabalus may harm or make uncomfortable people who listen to this podcast who may be transgender. If it's important to you to believe that Elagabalus was transgender, you should go ahead and believe that. The records are not that great on this. It's hard to really do that, though, based on what we do know about him. But as Dr. Herz points out, it may well be appropriate to use the pronoun they when discussing Elagabalus. So, my personal opinion, I think that that's a fair thing to do. Anyway, I hope that people listen to that part of this discussion and understand that we're coming at this from a caring, a sensitive, and understanding viewpoint. And again, we're not trying to take away an icon for anyone here. Also, do some more reading about about this emperor. He's a very fascinating character. He was involved in some key attempted religious reforms. And the way that Rome reacted to him is something very much worth studying as we live in an era where there is a great deal of change to expected social norms. This is a period of history worth studying, and I hope you enjoy this next episode with Dr. Zachary Herz. Dr. Zachary Herz, how are you, sir? And apologies for saying sir, but like we discussed, my grandparents will know.
You're allowed one, and I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. With first time guests, I like to have them tell us their origin story. So if you could, how did you end up getting interested in Roman history?
So for me, it really started more with the language. I studied Latin in high school. I was very fortunate to have that opportunity, and I just liked it. I liked the literature. I enjoyed reading the language, and I started getting more and more into it to the extent where I majored in classics in college. But I'd always thought I wanted to be a lawyer. And really, sort of my fork in the road was when I started reading Roman legal scholarship and just thinking, none of these people know how law works. I think that's much less true now, but if you look at much older Roman legal scholarship, the kind that people were, giving to a random college student in 2007, um, it was clear that people weren't thinking very hard about how this would actually work in a society, how it would work in a courtroom. My mother is a lawyer. I grew up in that environment, and I went to one of my professors and just said, I think this is wrong. Am I crazy? And they just said, yeah, you got a point. Maybe you should look at graduate school. And that's kind of how it happened.
Okay. And that embarked you on a career. And actually, where I came across you was on the Emperors of Rome podcast episodes that you did, not in the outline, but I actually re-listened to all three of those to get ready for today. How did you end up connecting with that podcast? And for those of you who haven't listened, you definitely should. They're very informative.
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, Matt Gibbs reached out to me and I had a very good time working with them. I'm reasonably online. My suspicion is I run an Instagram for my dog that is primarily Roman legal trivia. It's sort of Roman legal scholarship as produced by a teacup Yorkie. And my suspicion is he may have encountered that and thought that made me sort of a good figure to introduce people to major figures within Roman legal history. I think my first podcast for him was a jurist named Ulpian, but I'm not entirely certain of that. I know that was one of them.
That is correct, and that was interesting. He was kind of a big deal. People knew him,
Yeah,
Ulpian, anyway.
this is very America specific, but I always think about Ulpian as what would happen if John Roberts was also Dick Cheney and also the Zodiac Killer, is how I usually introduce Ulpian to people.
I'm really not trying to comment on the current state of the law, but I think the answer would be that would be Justice Alito.
I think that's right.
Uh, okay, well, we agree on that.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to leave it there. Just going to leave it there. Now, before we turn to the topic of today,
Yes.
which is a very famous Roman emperor who had a very short reign, but yet is remembered. Could we clarify the pronunciation? Because I listened to about 10 or 12 podcasts about him before this. I had said Elagabalus, but other people pronounce it at different things. I'm from the upstate of South Carolina, which is a real place for those of you who don't know. That's a real place. It's not just for New York. But I just wondered if perhaps my southernness has me pronouncing it wrong. What is in the range of acceptability for Elagabalus?
I mean, he's dead. Nobody cares. It's the I there is a lot of variation on this. Part of the problem is that it's not actually his name. Elagabalus's his sort of real names are quite confusing. We think it's Vitus Varius. His regnal name is Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, but there are three or four emperors with that, so he's not commonly referred to as that in the historiography. Elagabalus is sort of a mean nickname, and the reasoning behind it will, I think, become apparent when I talk about his biography. But it's not a real name, which means the stakes of this are nil. Um, sort of an old, it's seen as a little bit old-fashioned to call him Heliogabalus. That appears in one of the biographies, but it's seen as a little bit fussy and doesn't really respond to what the name actually comes from, which is his worship of a Semitic deity named Elagabalus. Um, I say Elagabalus. Um, Elagabalus is also used pretty frequently. Um, I'm I don't believe there's any regional variation on this. If there is a particular upstate South Carolinian way of talking about this emperor, this is my first time encountering it.
Uh, I I doubt that there is something that specific, but I am always cognizant that perhaps the Southern pronunciation has its own uniqueness to it. So,
Yeah, in this case, there is not a right answer because it's not a real name. We have no idea where the stress would have fallen. I leave the Helio out. It makes him sound like it's a Greek sun god, which it isn't quite. But Elagabalus, put your stresses anywhere you want.
all right. Well, we'll just take it and run with it and see what happens. But how did you end up studying him? What led you to that specific emperor, of which there were many to choose from?
So this is actually I come at Elagabalus from a very different angle than most people who focus on this particular emperor. Again, as we're going to talk about later, Elagabalus becomes this sort of queer icon. And so a lot of study of Elagabalus comes from that angle, from queer history, and especially recently from trans history. Um, I care about him because his successor is very important for Roman law. That's kind of it. Um, The Elagabalus is installed on the throne in a coup financed by his grandmother, who then pays soldiers to kill him and install her other grandson. Again, we'll give more details. It's a good story. That other kid is
And
this.
I thought my family had problems.
Yeah, grandma's salty. Ever seen August Osage County? But Severus Alexander, the other cousin, is an enormously important figure in the development of Roman law. He takes on Ulpian, that guy I mentioned earlier, as a kind of regent. The empire under Alexander is described as run by lawyers. And a lot of that is pretty explicitly framed as a return to normalcy after this weird, sort of possibly transgender, definitely murderous teenage meteorite cultist who reigned right before him. So to understand Severus Alexander, you're wading through all of this material on Elagabalus. And I got into him through that. Like he's fun. I've done more work on him since then. But really, I'm interested in mostly because a lot of Roman law is built in opposition to him in some fairly subtle ways.
So we've talked about him generally, kind of poked around the outsides of it, but just tell us who Elagabalus was and how he ends up becoming a Roman emperor.
All right. I might do this kind of as monologue. I hope that's okay. Feel free to cut me off or ask follow-up questions if you need to. So the So the story really starts in 217 when an emperor named Caracalla, your audience might know about him. He's a very big figure in Gladiator 2. He's sort of a pretty important Roman emperor in his own right. He's stabbed to death while pooping on the side of a road. And his basically chief of staff, Praetorian prefect, takes the throne in a coup. This is a guy named Macrinus. Nobody really likes Macrinus. He's not a senator. He's sort of suspicious. People don't really trust him, and he's only in for like a year or so. But it's obvious that he's weak and going to collapse. At this point, a very rich woman in Syria named Julia Maesa, who has some complicated family connections to Caracalla and his father, Septimius Severus, but really is pretty much out of power. So a local patroness starts spending huge amounts of money to bribe soldiers to install her grandson on the throne. Her grandson is this random kid. We don't really know his name. He's often referred to as Warius. That's how he shows up in some of the biographies. And what Warius has to recommend him is, again, he's from this very rich family, and he holds the priesthood to this local god, this local sun god named Elagabal, right? That's kind of all we know for sure. The soldiers revolt, put him on the throne. Macrinus tries to suppress the revolt, is defeated at the Battle of Antioch. He's killed. His son is killed. Well, now Elagabalus is in. The problem is he's 14 years old, not particularly well acquainted with Roman politics. He's in this very different area with this very idiosyncratic politics, where he was a very big deal because of this priesthood. And you can see him trying very hard to reformulate what it means to be a Roman emperor around this. People dispute whether he's a religious fanatic or whether this is a political strategy, but he starts talking about this god constantly. He has this meteor that is supposed to be the god incarnate brought to Rome. He establishes temples to this god. He marries this god off to a deity that has a longer tradition of worship in the city, the Magna Mater. There's crazy religious imagery on coins from this time. And he's also spreading this rumor at the same time that he's the illegitimate son of Caracalla, the guy who got stabbed to death. No one believes that rumor. No one likes this kid. He's a random teenager who's talking about this god that nobody cares about. Not hugely popular as far as we can tell. At some point, about 3 years in, he is pressured, we're not quite sure of how this works, to appoint his first cousin, a guy named Severus Alexander, as his Caesar, essentially junior emperor, right? Alexander immediately starts being the most boring, traditional person alive, and there's very quickly a lot of intrigues around this. People wanting to get Elagabalus out of the way and bring in Alexander.
Well, and Alexander would have been really young at that time too, right?
He's 12. I mean, we're dealing with children. We are entirely dealing with children. This But everyone hates this guy. There are mean nicknames swirling. This is when the name Elagabalus or Elagabal dude comes up. It's what we conventionally use. And at some point, again,
So
we're
wait,
not.
that's what Elagabalus means?
Yeah, just Elagabal dude, basically. He's also referred to as fake Antoninus after Antoninus, because he was calling himself Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. Dio refers to him as the pseudo Antoninus. Varius, the Historia Augusta makes a dirty joke that he was named Varius because no one was sure who the father was. There were various fathers. It's the names are blurry, which is why we just call him Elagabalus conventionally. But at some point, 4 years after he comes in, soldiers kill him, kill his mother, and install the cousin Severus Alexander on the throne. The grandmother stays in power. She's really the power behind the throne. But now there's a different child emperor who immediately appoints these regents, and kind of everything is fine for about 13 years until this child emperor is himself killed, and then everything, goes to hell. It's the 3rd century.
So, one, the Romans not maybe the best at casting shade or insults. I mean, the insult comedy seemed a little uncreative there for the naming, but
To be fair, there are a lot more creative ones about Elagabalus. Before I go into them, I have to ask, is your podcast recommended for all audiences?
we can put an E on it if necessary. I haven't really thought too much about that element of it.
Because all the good stuff about Elagabalus is wild.
Well, let's do that. Let's just have fun. The name of the podcast is got the term side quest in it, so let's just go crazy with it. That's what I say.
Okay, remember, if you're watching with children, fast forward to, say the timestamp, add the timestamp later.
Okay, folks, skip ahead about 10 minutes. This next part of the conversation may not be kid appropriate, but it's history, it's facts. And just use your judgment throughout the rest of the interview if you've got youngsters around. We'll take care of it in post. So
fabulous.
His reign though was real short. I mean, he was not in power for very long.
No, it's from the ages of 14 to 18, which makes the whole thing very creepy. But a lot of the invective about Elagabalus, and this interacts with his racial identity and his religious identity in complicated ways, is about how this kid is the horniest person alive. It is, from our perspective now, kind of wildly homophobic and transphobic. There's a story about how he will only appoint civil servants He is sending sort of members of his household to find very well-hung men that he will then appoint to high positions in the Roman civil service. Um, he is frequently going out in public dressed as a woman, dressed as a prostitute, actually selling his services. He is inviting prostitutes into the palace as dinner party companions. He is constantly seeking out sexual partners. Notably, it's not just men. He is also marries a Vestal virgin and sort of defiles the most holy woman in Roman religion. Um, but he is, according to the biographies, and again, I don't really think a lot of this is true. We'll get into that. He's obsessed with sex. He's obsessed specifically with finding men to penetrate him. And he's at one point described as trying to contract with surgeons to have what we would now call sexual confirmation surgery or gender assignment surgery, essentially to have a vaginoplasty. Again, it's described a little bit more crudely in the ancient biographies, but this all shows up. There's a fabulous story where someone addresses him as Lord Kyrios, and he says, "Call me not Lord, I am Lady, not Kyrios, Kyrie." It's great. It is ridiculous, and we really have no way of knowing what his actual gender presentation or sex life is like, but they're wildly entertaining stories. This is sort of the thing you bust out when you feel like your undergraduate class is getting away from you and you need to get their attention. That's when we all throw in the unit on Elagabalus.
So, who wrote all this? Because this sounds like, I mean, when I remember listening to this for the first time when I listened to the history of Rome, then I listened to the Emperors of Rome discussion about it and some other podcasts that were kind of saying, look, we can't really necessarily take all this at face value. A lot of it's invective, a lot of it's just he was a teenager, and B, he was from modern day Syria, so he's outside of Rome, and he was upsetting a lot of established norms. And we can talk more about the religious norms and the Vestal. I can't imagine the PR guy who signed off on that, like, oh yeah, don't worry about it, that's fine, that wouldn't cause problems. I mean, they've buried those people alive in the past, but where does this hostility and these recounting of sources come from? Who is writing this?
So there's the sort of who and the why. The who are good sources for this. It's a little more complicated, but not by much. Are old school, somewhat politically conservative senators who are importantly writing under the reign of that successor I talked about, Severus Alexander. So they have a lot. Alexander hated Elagabalus, and there was a lot of incentive, we think, to make Elagabalus look terrible. That's part of it. But part of it is these are people who are very attached to an older way of being an emperor. Literally, in the sense that good emperors were supposed to be grown men, they were supposed to be older, but also in the sense that an emperor is supposed to collaborate with the Senate and show traditional Roman virtue and respect Roman traditions and blah, 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 right? Elagabalus clearly doesn't do that, and that really bothers people. So that's where a lot of the invective comes from. And one of the things about Roman invective more broadly is that a lot of things that we might think of as an ethnic stereotype, people who act like they're from particularly the Eastern Mediterranean, get folded from Romans into this homophobic stereotype of sort of a sex crazed gay man who likes to be penetrated. That's seen as an Eastern stereotype. And this kid is from Syria and acts like it. He is wearing Eastern garb. He's sort of speaking a lot of Greek. He's practicing this weird Eastern religion that no one knows anything about. And in the Roman mind, those things are all going to look gay, for lack of a better word. They're all going to make him look like this sexual deviant because it's all part of the same network of stereotypes. And accordingly, it gets mixed up with sexuality in some really inflammatory ways. We really don't know. I do think this kid was emperor from 14 to 18. I think if you take the average teenage boy and put him in a position of absolute power over the entire Mediterranean basin, he's probably going to have sex and it's probably going to be weird. That just feels like an accurate depiction of teenagers. But there's no reason to think it was nearly as theatrical, for lack of a better word, as what shows up in the sources.
So was the problem with him? So essentially back then they would have been referring to him as effeminate, womanly, right? Saying he's like a woman, he's weak. We've got our toxic masculinity culture, that kind of a thing going on. And just so the audience can understand, I guess what we would term now homosexual relationships between men were okay back then based on certain social classes and who was, to go back to It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, who was asserting dominance, that kind of a thing. And the idea is Elagabalus was not doing that, right? He was the passive partner.
Right. When I teach this material in a gender and sexuality class, what's important to understand about the kind of person we're talking about, it's a Roman archetype known as the conitus, is that it's not homosexual in the sense that a conitus might sleep with women. It's really a slur that denotes the boundaries of acceptable male sexuality and male gender presentation. I often translate it in my own work with the F slur, if that helps. It really should be understood in that slightly incoherent way, where sort of being too nice to your wife might come off as F slur, right? There's sort of, it gets very incoherent at the boundaries, and conitis works in a very similar way. In terms of how Roman men are expected to do their gender and sexuality, there's a lot of, there's a lot of normative masculinity, expectations of how men are supposed to behave. And if you violate those, you're going to get labeled with this slur. Those expectations are not, as you said, heterosexual in the way that we would understand it. There's room for a Roman man to have sex with another man and have that not be seen as problematic. There's a lot of, for lack of a better word, attention paid to role. I haven't seen It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, so this may be what you're getting at. I don't know. I don't like to think of Danny DeVito in that way. But
well, no, it was the character Mac talking about his father, but it was right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Basically, men are allowed to play the insertive role in homosexual sex without impugning any sort of black mark on their character or masculinity. Receptive role, much less so. Elagabalus, the invective about Elagabalus, makes a very big deal, not out of his having sex with men, but out of his being anally penetrated by men. That's constantly the topic of discussion. He dresses like a woman and he has sex like a woman. That's not to say he has sex with men, but to say he has feminine sex with men. He lets other men treat him like a woman in bed. It is, again, wildly overdetermined. He's so effeminate, he wants to be a woman. He's so effeminate, he's hiring these sort of well-hung dudes to, run the tax office. It all feels almost parodic, but it is a parody around this very coherent Roman trope of gendered abuse.
And so when this is the part that in my mind, as I try to conceptualize it, that we struggle with when we're using our terminology that we have today about homosexual, heterosexual, those were not concepts, were they, as much in the ancient world?
No, not at all. Or they have some awareness that people might have preferences, but those preferences are not thought of as an identity. My favorite example here is one of the imperial biographies. I want to say it's Suetonius's Life of Galba. Mentions just as an aside that Galba vastly preferred sex with men to sex with women. And the reverse, and I want to say the reverse is in the Life of Claudius, that he preferred sex with women to sex with men. But it's mentioned as a casual detail, the way that you might say this person only dates women who are taller than he is, or he only dates blondes. That it is a fact that a person might be aware of. If your friend only dates blondes, you're going to pay attention to that if you're trying to pick them up with someone. But there's not a parade about it. It's not something that's understood as constitutive of identity. It's not a part of who you are in the same way that sexual orientation is for us now.
So when we're trying to go back and reconstruct his reign and make sense of this 4 years that he was in power, how much are we able to tell actually is accurate of what we know? Because I do want to talk about that later when we discuss how we should view him as a, like you said, a queer icon or a trans icon.
$1 million question, and scholars disagree about this even today. I'm probably a little bit more skeptical of the biography than most people, but not by much. And sort of there's a lot of range in the scholarship. Basically, no one takes the biographies perfectly literally. I take them as sort of an imaginative set of attacks that are keying off of probably some real differences. And the way that we know about those differences is actually not in the biographies, it's in things like the coins. I mentioned earlier that we see this religious imagery related to the god Elagabal in Elagabalic numismatics, i.e., the coins that are produced when Elagabalus is emperor. Those aren't lying, right? Elagabalus wanted those issued. We actually know for a fact these were around and circulated. We feel very confident about that. And that sort of backs up the idea that Elagabalic religion is strange. We know he constructed that temple because Severus Alexander rededicates it to Jupiter. We know, so we know there are temples to Elagabal. We know there's religious processions involving Elagabal. That stuff we know not from the biographies. We have actual physical evidence of those. And I count that a lot more than I count the stories that people tell about his life. What those show is that he looks weird. When Elagabalus appears on coins, he might be wearing priestly garments. He doesn't wear traditional Roman clothes. But he also has a beard. He's very obviously sort of a teenage boy, a pubescent man. Sort of he's in this period of highly Hellenized youth. Sort of Greek models of a kid this age. He's clearly engaged with those in his portraiture, but it's all male. There's literally facial hair. And to me, that's very hard to get around if you want to argue about Elagabalus as trans.
And you're actually cited on the Wikipedia page about how to make sense of the history about that. And there is certainly a scholarship that says, hey, we need to be careful about some of this. But as we try to unpack kind of where things started to go wrong for Elagabalus during his reign, you've mentioned his religious reforms. Was it that caused the problem? Was it the Vestal Virgin? I mean, what were the main things that caused friction with the ruling class?
This is one of those things where it's very, very hard to say because, the coins don't say the entire Senate hates me and here's why. That's not the kind of thing you're going to find real evidence of. And the biographies are all saying sort of people became annoyed that he defiled the traditions of Rome or whatever, and you have to take that with a grain of salt as well. There's a friend of mine, Adam Kamezis, has, I think, the most plausible take on this, which is it's just court intrigue. The next 50 years of Roman history are going to be dominated by these sort of shifting power politics, and a lot of short-reigned emperors are around between 235 and 284. Elagabalus, arguably Macrinus, starts that trend. And if you look at him from that perspective, he's much less unusual. This is just a period when things are falling apart, and that makes being at the top of the ticket very unstable and very dangerous. That's, I think, a very plausible argument. I also think there's an element of he is bad at being emperor in the sense that there are a lot of unwritten rules to being an emperor during the Principate. And Elagabalus, who's sort of plopped on the throne out of nowhere without a lot of formal training in these rules, just doesn't know what to do. He doesn't seem to have people around him who know what to do. Because conventions of Roman emperorship have the emperor sort of being adopted as an adult by the prior emperor. That's what happened to Trajan, that's what happened to Hadrian, that's what happened to Annius Pius, Marcus Aurelius, yada, yada, yada. These are people who have been engaging closely with the emperor in administration for a long time and who have a sense of how you're supposed to act to win over other stakeholders. Elagabalus has no idea what's happening. And it's very easy for me to see him rapidly alienating a lot of different for lack of a better word, stakeholder groups because of that inexperience. The army seems the Praetorian Guard seems very willing to turn on Elagabalus at the end. He may not have been paying them enough. He may not have been managing that relationship effectively. The Senate hated him because he didn't have the language to hand with which you're expected to flatter them. These are a lot of complicated rules and norms that Elagabalus is breaking without even trying to. And it's easy for me to see that as one reason why people are so upset. But I don't think we know. I think it's lost to history.
So his religious reforms that well, I guess you'd call them reforms or whatever terminology you want to use. I mean, it seemed like he had some serious devotion to this cult that he believed in. Some historians have talked about how that kind of set the stage later for the worship of Sol Invictus. I haven't done a lot of research on that, but it seemed a little hard to make that connection. Do you have any insight on that?
Oh, it's really hard. I mean, I don't think, I think, I certainly don't think you can argue that this sort of widely disliked emperor cultist is laying the groundwork for the role of Sol Invictus in sort of later pre-Christian Roman history, or pre-Christian, later Roman history. I think they're probably coming from the same place. One of the things you're seeing in the 3rd century that's starting to freak people out, and it's why some of these biographies are so anxious, is that the center of gravity of the Roman Empire is moving east. Your audience can't see this, but I'm moving my hands very slowly. You can picture that. Things are kind of drifting. The emperors in this late period are going to be often Greek or Balkan is very common. The soldier emperors come from Illyria. Obviously, this is best known in the context of Constantinople, but sun worship, and this particular kind of quasi-monotheistic sun worship, is just a feature of the Eastern Mediterranean. Like, there are sun cults running around. And I am inclined to read these sort of growth of Sol Invictus as part of that broader trend. I'm a little bit over my skis here, and there may be some very good scholarly answer that I just don't have to mind. But I am inclined to think of these changes in Roman religion as epiphenomenal too, as kind of downstream of the broader Easternizing of the Roman Empire that's taking place at this time.
It just seemed in my mind if this teenager was so hated, so disliked that they got rid of him and his family turned on him, that it would be a stretch to say, but also his religious actions were so profoundly accepted that it set us on a course of monotheism. It just seems weird to me.
It's very weird. It's for a family podcast, I'm just going to say it's BS. It is silly, but it is the case that you're starting to see different kinds of religious tradition crop up in the Roman Empire at around this time and crop up at very high levels. But I think it's easier to understand Elagabalus as one instantiation of that, and it's other ones that really take hold. Elagabalus is not causing anything.
Right. So let's kind of think about him and his legacy, and I don't want to take something away from people, but to go back to the trans element, should we consider him as a historical trans figure, or should we just say, I'm not so sure about that? I mean, I don't want to take something away from people who are already being demonized politically in this country for reasons that are just horribly offensive and disgusting. But how should we, from a historical perspective, assess that?
I really struggle with this as well. And I think you've laid out the stakes. I completely agree with you. I think you've laid them out perfectly. It's on one hand, I think as a historical matter, there's not good evidence that Elagabalus saw himself as not masculine. This is, I think, what he thought masculinity was. Certainly what someone in his social background would have thought masculinity was. On the other hand, it's like, if my students want to think this kid is trans, like, mazel tov. Well, why would I stop them? I don't really care. One thing I often think about in the context of Elagabalus is, again, I've kind of talked around it, but the stories are wild. And there's something to me a little bit uncomfortable about taking basically people writing porn about a dead teenager and then us taking that porn as fact in order to sort of reclaim him as a queer icon. I just find it unsettling, personally. The way I often teach Elagabalus is whether or not Elagabalus is a good example of a trans person or a gay person or a queer person. What happens to Elagabalus is a very good example of homophobia, of transphobia, of queerphobia, of what we might call a toxic masculinity. It is people looking at a world that is confusing. Oh my God, the emperor is 14. Oh my God, the emperor is wearing a dress. What is that rock doing on that chariot? Why is there an eagle here? What is going on? Just looking at these very strange new political conventions and immediately understanding it as like a sexual and gender deviance. That we're going to make this a manliness problem because manliness problems are problems I understand and know how to solve. And I think that is a very clear historical analog. And you can sort of see that analogy, see how dangerous it is, see how violent it is, without having to get overly concerned with what like a random teenager wanted his junk to look like. There, you can sort of focus on the questions that are a little bit easier to attest from the sources that we have. Um, I will say when I teach Elagabalus, I do sometimes use they, them pronouns in the same way that like if I were to tell you about my student named Alex and we were to have a conversation about them, you'd probably default to they, them because that name doesn't give you info. Um, we have enough information to think, Elagabalus could have something odd with their gender identity. They could in some way not fit into a traditional gender binary. We don't have enough evidence to be sure, but we have enough to make us not sure what to do. And in English, when you're not sure what to do, we have a pronoun for that. It's called they, them.
So it sounds like the conclusion would be he's a good example at the very least of phobias and the studying of phobias and how to understand how phobias work historically.
Yes, he's the subject of a sexualized, gendered moral panic.
Well, and what's interesting was his reign was so short, but he seems talked about a lot more than other emperors, and perhaps it is because of that phobia element that's attached to it.
Well, it's a few different things. And one of them is a little bit technical. It's that our sources get so much worse after he dies. I mentioned that we have these biographers who are writing under the next guy, Severus Alexander. They all finish while Alexander is emperor. So they either don't talk about him or only talk about him very briefly and without good info. And then the sourcing is terrible for the next like 50, 60 years. We don't have a great sense of what's going on after this guy. And that's one of the reasons why he's talked about a lot is we just have more about him than we do about the other sort of short-lived emperors of the third century. But it is also the case that people in more contemporary periods, there's sort of a romantic reception of Elagabalus, this icon of religious tolerance. You sort of mentioned that earlier, that he's bringing in monotheism. Sort of early queer movements will sort of bring up Elagabalus as an example of sort of the liberatory spirit of the ancients. People use Elagabalus to argue with. In some ways, it's easier because he is so young. We don't have a lot of him talking about himself. You can kind of put whatever you want onto him. But it is strange. He gets a lot more ink than you would expect for a 4-year emperor reigning at the end of the Severan dynasty. I mean, as a specialist in the Severan dynasty, no one cares about the Severan dynasty, so it's mystifying.
So one thing that I wanted to follow up with you on that was you said that Alexander hated Elagabalus. What was the reason for that?
Well, Elagabalus might have tried to have him killed. Bad
Look,
blood.
it's a rough time period. That's just the cost of doing business.
Yeah. I mean, I cannot speak to the internal dynamics of Julian Maece's descendants. That's not possible. But it is a violent family feud that Alexander wins. There's no reason to think that they were close. There's also a lot of political value in Alexander portraying Elagabalus as an aberration, such that, like, again, I think they probably did hate each other. They tried to kill each other. It wouldn't surprise me. But there's a lot of political value for Alexander in playing that up, in portraying himself as a return to normalcy after this sort of aberrant period of Elagabalus's rule. Um, we don't have to get too invested in anybody's emotions to sort of see that trend in representation or trend in messaging. But yeah, I'm sure they hated each other's guts. Wouldn't you?
My brother and I fought a lot. Yeah, I mean, it happens.
Did you hire hitmen?
Well, we didn't have a lot of money, so
Exactly.
right.
Exactly. You know, poor little rich kids.
First world problems. I don't know though. Feel like the wealth for the Roman emperors would have to go past first world. It would have to be something else.
Whole world?
Yeah, I mean, I can't even begin to imagine the wealth that the people at the top of that social ladder had.
So Elagabalus actually is one of the biographies of Elagabalus that we talk about a lot. It spends like 10 or 15 chapters on Elagabalus's extremely elaborate dinner parties. So again, none of it's true, but it's sort of fun to imagine. We know this sort of insane parties he will set up. So there's a very famous story of him having a dining hall equipped with a trick ceiling. So halfway through a dinner party, he would release rose petals, and he released them in such great quantity that some of the guests died. Um, he's described as sort of only eating fish when he's far inland, but never eating fish when he's on the coast. He invented a blue sauce to help make seafood look fresher. He would grate pearls over his food. Very, very strange stuff. No reason to think any of this tastes good. He apparently is quite innovative in sort of new technologies in perfume. You can kind of picture this. It's a lot of goofy lifestyles of the rich and famous stuff that, again, is playing off of the same stereotypes as his weird sexual practices. It's just he likes pleasure too much. It's suspicious.
Boy, the Romans were really catty. I mean, my
Yeah,
God.
yeah. Very funny, very catty.
Well, you were describing the dinner parties, and when you said none of it was true, I wondered if it was more like the dinner party episode of The Office at Michael's condo. If you've seen that episode,
I no, I these are not things I watch. Lately, I've been getting really, I think when The Office was on, I was obsessed with sort of reruns of Buffy. And do you remember Jane the Virgin? I loved that.
I remember that was a show, but I don't think I ever watched it.
Oh, it was fabulous. Gina Rodriguez is a national treasure.
Okay. Oh, so that was on like the CW or something?
Yeah, really good.
Okay. Well, the dinner party episode of The Office is like the peak of awkward, uncomfortable humor.
Okay.
It's whenever my wife's having a bad day, she watches that episode, and it cheers her up. So you should definitely watch that. Now, as a I'm trying to think of how we could sum up the legacy of Elagabalus, and I wonder if it's not so much him as a ruler, if it's maybe how historians and his contemporaries thought of him. And I just keep thinking, the poor kid, he's a teenager. He's in charge of this gigantic bureaucratic empire. It's starting to really fray and fall apart. And I just keep thinking of Taylor Swift's song "Mean" in that line, "Why you got to be so mean." My wife and daughter are humongous Swifties, so I got to be the dad at the concert this summer, by
Oh,
the
fun.
way. Yeah, it actually was. We went to London and
Ooh.
they went to the concert. I watched while waiting for them outside of Wembley. I went to a movie theater. The only thing that was playing was the newest Bad Boys movie.
Oh, how was it?
Well, I had not seen movies 1 through 3. Surprisingly, that plot line, you need to have seen the first couple of movies.
Oh, I didn't realize it was sort of a dense plot-driven franchise. I didn't realize there was lore.
I wouldn't say it's dense. I wouldn't quite go that far, but I've now seen all 4 of them. But then the next day we went around and saw the Mithras temple and the Roman walls there. It was a lot of fun.
I mean, I think there is, I find the story of Elagabalus in some, as a person who struggles with an imposter complex, I find the story of Elagabalus extraordinarily relatable. He is given this insanely difficult job that he just doesn't know how to do, and that no one around him can tell him how to do. And because he does it wrong, sort of he and his mother are both killed. It is in some ways a very sad story, but the legacy of it is, to my mind, almost totally distinct from the kid himself. The legacy of Elagabalus is, to me, a Roman political culture that is completely obsolete and doesn't quite know it yet, trying to describe new political phenomena in old language. You know, Elagabalus is a child emperor. Severus Alexander, his successor, who I've talked about a few times, he's a child emperor. Over the next 50 years, you're going to see a bunch of child emperors. They just become a part of the grammar of Roman society because the emperor becomes more of a figurehead. The administrative state gets more of a mind of its own. The emperor becomes a much more ceremonial position, even as it gets more formally powerful. But that's not how things work. That's not how Elagabalus' contemporaries understand things to work just yet. They think something's really wrong. And so they're reaching for language to describe it that is simply old-fashioned. And it's a mismatch. It's crazy because they don't have a mental framework that can accommodate what's actually happening in front of them. And so instead they reach for like, this teenage boy is a slut. It's very awkward.
Well, and the good thing is there's no modern parallels to that situation that you just described.
I don't want to, yeah, Jesus Christ. It is a very Severan material was a little bit on trend on the job market when I was going up in sort of 2017, 2018. There were reasons for that. And yeah, we're good.
We haven't even got, because you do have, as you mentioned, a legal background. You and I could discuss that for quite a long time, but that is a side quest not suited for this podcast. So a couple other things I wanted to ask you about. You mentioned you're reasonably online, which I like that phrasing. Where can we find you reasonably online?
I am going to put relevant handles in chat.
Okay.
Um, on Twitter and Blue Sky, I am just at Zachary Herz. Zachary Herz is Z as in zebra, Achary, Herz as in zebra. The Roman Law Dog Instagram is, this will make a lot more sense to your readers who know some Latin. Moose Maiorum, that's Moose And I just put those in your chat.
Got it. Got it. Now tell us what would be a good future podcast episode for the side quest here, and I will try to make it happen. No promises, but I
I
will try.
mean, I do think Ulpian is a good topic. Ulpian or Roman law more broadly. It's Roman law itself, sort of overall, can get a little bit boring, but I think Ulpian is not a boring figure. Lex Imperio Vespasiani, I don't know if you've had someone talk about Justinian yet. I'm probably not the best to talk about him, but he's a fun character.
We did one on Belisarius and overlapped a little bit with that.
That makes sense.
Okay, so we've got a commit then from you to come back at some point to talk about Ulpian. So I like that. That's good. And Roma, you mentioned too, and I'd like to talk to you about this later at some point, the development of slave law into corporate law, which again, with Chevron deference going away, no parallels to modern society at all.
I mean, this is one of those things that can get a little bit overdrawn, but there are certain things that corporate law solves. And Roman in a modern culture, and we could talk about, so we can sort of we can talk about corporations or people until we're blue in the face, but there is real value to the corporate shield. There is value to the corporate form in a complicated commercial society. And Roman law does a surprising amount of that through what we would call slave law, through aspects of its law of persons. Your listeners might know, corporate law in America is technically, if we have these divisions, law of persons. A corporation is a fake person, essentially. You're inventing a new class of legal subject who can contract and have liabilities and blah, 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 blah.
And have freedom of exercise of religion at times.
Yeah, exactly. And
just like we planned.
Yes, and Roman law does a lot of this through its law of slavery in some pretty interesting ways. It's not always obvious to us how this works in practice, but a good case has been made that Roman slavery practices sort of directly lead to corporate law as we get it now.
Excellent. And I would like to talk to you about that in more detail another time. But what a book or books that you would recommend to us from the antiquity time period?
For this particular topic, I think there's a really obvious best book. It is called The Crimes of Elagabalus. It is by, I'm going to, again, put this in the chat because I have no suspicion you're going to get this right the first time, Martijn X.
We'll not get it right anytime.
MirtijnIcks. The Crimes of Elagabalus. It's a wonderful book. And it's maybe half about Elagabalus himself and half about Elagabalus's reception in later contemporary periods, which I think is the only sort of good way to talk about him. I think that's really the best thing that's been written on him in the last 20 years or so. And it's very, very engaging. I would also recommend there's some material on Elagabalus in Mary Beard's book, Emperors of Rome. Not a lot, but that might be an interesting place, and I will recommend her to anyone.
Well, Dr. Herz, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. This was very informative. It was a very interesting talk, and I know that people are going to enjoy this. And folks, again, if you want to stay in touch with us, you can find us on Twitter. I'm not calling it X, will not happen, at Antiquity Pod. Most of the other socials at Duke FB Coverage. I'm not going to repeat the history here of how it evolved. Our website, boldcitycoordinators.com. You can go there, call the podcast, leave us a voicemail. We'll get you on the air. And folks, remember, the Classical Antiquity Sidequest is a podcast without end.